In this Washington Journal segment, national security expert Mark Montgomery lays bare the dangers facing the Trump administration. Here's what you need to know and what's at stake.
Thank you for having me, Mimi.
So let's talk about the speech yesterday at the UN, and we'll drill down in details. But what was your overall impression?
It was a mix.
Montgomery begins by addressing the strain on intelligence agencies under this administration. Listen to this excerpt.
And criticizing some of the nations there, some of whom deserve it. I mean, this was not unexpected. He then went into a pretty long discussion of his peacekeeping efforts, which are not insignificant. You know, he has resolved a number of crises around the world, whether it's Cambodia, Thailand, India, Pakistan, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Democratic Republic of Congo, and Rwanda. He has had an effect. But then he got into the neat stuff, and that was what's he going to do, what his take was on Russia and Ukraine, and really a significant change in how he's spoken about that in the past.
That was definitely big news, but I want to just ask you about the effectiveness of the UN. Here's a portion of what the president said yesterday about the UN and what effect it's had in world crises.
In that segment, he warns about lapses in coordination between security agencies, a serious concern given rising global threats.
Tremendous potential, but it's not even coming close to living up to that potential. For the most part, at least for now, all they seem to do is write a really strongly worded letter and then never follow that letter up. It's empty words, and empty words don't solve war. The only thing that solves war and wars is action.
What do you think of that?
Next, he turns to foreign policy and the challenge of rebuilding alliances. Let's hear what he has to say.
They do more than that, but he's correct that they have not been effective in resolving significant, crises around the world. And he's talking also about the various agencies within the UN that distribute food, water, world health, things like that. He's been frustrated with them, but very much here he was talking about, I think, their military engagements to attempt to broker peace. And he's right. If you think of something like UNIFIL, the UN standing force in Lebanon, it did nothing to put Hezbollah back north of the Litani River as they're supposed to. The only thing that did it, as he averred to there, was Israeli action last year. So that was a 20-year failure by the UN. And there's other examples of that. It turns out they're not empowered to do the kind of work that's necessary. I'll give you one of the good examples. In Rwanda, when we dropped in international forces under a UN banner, they were unsuccessful. So broadly speaking, I would say the UN has struggled over the last 30 years.
Do you mean militarily they have not been effective? Yeah. Because they do have a force not under their control. It's still under the control of the countries that supply those soldiers. They're called the Blue Helmets.
Yeah, I'm talking about the peacekeeping forces that they put forward, like into Lebanon. There's 3 or 4 countries that contribute to a UN headquartered force. And just generally speaking, the Blue Helmets do fine when the belligerents are peaceful. In other words, the Blue Helmets are able to monitor a peaceful, even if it's uncomfortable existence. What they can't do is properly control an escalating situation because they just aren't given the right types of forces and the right rules of engagement to do that kind of work.
So would you advocate for a change in the rules of engagement to make them more effective?
I mean, 2 choices here. One, you could do what we've done in the past, which is coalitions of the willing, like to remove Iraq from Kuwait, things like that. Or, in 1991, or you can strengthen the UN. I don't think with the kind of consensual decision making that has to go on at a UN Security Council where 5 countries have vetoes, you're going to get the kind of rules of engagement you need. So he's starting, he's saying out loud what a lot of us have known quietly for the last 3 or 4 decades. UN peacekeepers are not a way to end a war. They're a way to monitor a peace.
Let's talk about the big news that came out yesterday. This is the AP. Trump says he now believes Ukraine can take back.
He argues that U.S. credibility abroad has been shaken. Strengthening ties will take more than rhetoric.
Pleasantly surprised. I'm still metered. You want to see action meet this rhetoric, and there's things that he'll need to direct to be done to kind of carry, to ensure this happens. In other words, he very much talked about providing all the weapons NATO wants to buy to arm Ukraine properly, and he will gladly do that, he said. We'll see if that really if the Department of Defense follows his lead on that. They have not followed him in everything he said over the last few months. So they've been more restrictive to Ukraine than the president has expressed publicly. So that's one thing. The second is he's right. He's right. Russia is a paper tiger. He's right. He called them a paper tiger. They're paper. They have been unable in 3.5 years to defeat a country, as he acknowledges, 10 times smaller than them. It's probably more like 4 to 7 times smaller, depending how you measure things, but still significantly smaller than them. With a surprise attack, they were unable to achieve victory, and he's just acknowledging what a lot of us see on the ground, which is Ukraine is not going to lose. One thing that's a little confusing, he said, get back all their territory, in the war, and then he said the war that started 3.5 years ago. Well, there's two different types of territory here. There's the 3 or 4% of Ukraine that they've grabbed over the last 3.5 years, or there's Crimea and the rest of Eastern.
Then he tackles defense spending and resource gaps. This part is especially striking.
2022. We'll have to get some clarity from him on what he thinks on that.
Here is the direct quote from the president as reported by the AP. Quote, I think Ukraine, with the support of the European Union, is in a position to fight and win all of Ukraine back in its original form. With time, patience, and the financial support of Europe, and in particular NATO, the original borders from where this war started is very much an option.
I mean, that's a big statement. That's a lot of offensive weapons.
Changes in President Trump's stance, from blaming Ukraine for the war to saying I can end it in a day, to rolling out the red carpet for Putin, to saying he's a friend of mine. This is going to be the easiest war to solve. So it's a lot going on.
So in his follow-on conversation, he had a bilateral discussion with Macron, during which, and with Zelensky, and during the press conferences associated with those, he said a few times how disappointed he is in Putin and how he thought he would be able to end the war, and he was not able to. And he put that correctly on Vladimir Putin. The president, rightly or wrongly, attempted to get a peaceful settlement here and got Ukraine to give a lot of concessions. But in the end, Vladimir Putin was not willing to move off of anything. He took advantage of the president's time horizons. I'll give you 2 weeks, I'll give you 4 weeks, to conduct significant critical infrastructure, cruise missile, ballistic missile attacks on Ukraine's critical infrastructure, killing civilians. That really infuriated Trump. He repeatedly said, knock it off. He repeatedly said it's inappropriate for the civilian targeting. And Putin continued it, and then doubled down on it a week ago with drones into Ukraine, MiG-31s into Estonia, drones into Romania. I think the president got tired of President Putin.
President Zelensky has continually asked President Trump to impose more sanctions on Russia. Where do those stand now? So
it's two units have to do this. The United States can do more, and Europe can do more. And the president properly noted yesterday that Europe needs to cease buying fossil fuels from Russia. There are a few holdouts there still: Slovakia, Hungary, Turkey. The European Union says they're working with those countries. Now, some of them don't belong to the European. Turkey doesn't belong to the European Union. The president can put some pressure on Turkey, on Erdogan. He can certainly put pressure on Orban, the leader of Hungary, to do it. In addition, the president has already put 25% tariffs on India for buying it. He could speak with Modi or threaten to increase that number to get Modi, the Prime Minister of India, to cease purchasing Russian fossil fuel from the shadow fleet. And then, of course, there's China, the largest recipient after India, and India being number 2, Turkey being number 3. China, the largest recipient. The president could bring shadow fleet specific tariffs onto China. I don't think that will alter China's behavior, but that would be a strong signal to Europe that I am taking this seriously. You need to cut off every ounce of Russian fossil fuel.
Mark Montgomery of the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies is our guest. If you'd like to talk to him, ask a question, make a comment, you can start calling in now. Our lines are by party. Democrats are on 202-748-8000, Republicans 202-748-8001, and Independents 202-748-8002. Let's talk about the war in Gaza. The president has criticized countries for recognizing a Palestinian state. Of course, he repeated the longstanding American policy of not recognizing a Palestinian state. But he said that that recognition rewards Hamas. Do you agree with that?
Well, I am frustrated with these countries at this point in time recognizing the Palestinian state. You know, only about 10 countries have recognized a Palestinian state over the last 20 years. You know, while we've been working through the Intifada and the various wars that Israel's had to fight against its neighbors. I think the proper thing now is to resolve the Hamas issue in Gaza, you know, to defeat Hamas, which is the natural, you know, if you're Israel after October 7th, I don't think there was a reasonable future in which Hamas could be left leading Gaza. And so I think it would have been better to allow that to resolve, begin the rebuilding of Gaza, and then make that kind of decision about what the future government looks like. I do appreciate that Prime Minister Starmer, when he was with the president 4 or 5 days ago, very explicitly said Hamas will have no leadership role will have no role in a future Gazan leadership of a Palestinian state or Gaza, and that's very important. I'm glad they make that qualification, but I think this was one of those issues that should have been held off till after the war was concluded.
Even if you say that Hamas will not have a leadership role, can't a new group with the same ideology, just with a new name, take over Gaza or other parts of the Palestinian territory?
Absolutely. I mean, this is the challenge, right? This is the challenge Israel faces. Why they're trying their hardest to actually eliminate the Hamas fighters is because you're right. They can come back under another name in the future. And
do you think that Israel can be effective militarily in destroying the ideology that gives birth to all those fighters that they're trying to kill?
I think that's unlikely. I think the IDF, quietly, the Israeli Defense Force, thinks that too. And we know from leaks that they were uncomfortable with this offensive campaign because they don't believe they can achieve that final result. So we'll have to see. I mean, the question is, can you eliminate all of them, or can you eliminate enough of them so that normal law enforcement and jurisprudence can take hold? That second issue, there's a potential for it, but if you recall, the way Hamas came to power was they won one election once. They then used that position of power to systematically destroy the other Palestinian leadership groups in Gaza. And so, you know, do I think that's likely again? It's certainly possible. I think the IDF shares that concern. All
right, let's talk to callers. We'll start with Mark, Hampstead, Maryland, Republican line. Hi, Mark.
Hey, good morning. So I really had initially told her to make a comment about the UN, but I guess that is tied in with the Israel-Gaza situation. I'd like to point out that the UN is a globalist organization. Their mission is against nations having their own sovereignty. This is an organization that from 1972 to 1981 had an actual Nazi as their Secretary General, a man named Kurt Waldheim, who later on wasn't even allowed into the United States. This is an organization that takes money from people. They're involved in groups like the WEF, the World Economic Forum, people like George Soros. The UN actually funded the invasion we had here in the United States over the last 4 years under Joe Biden,
all right,
which, as far as I'm concerned, is treason.
Let's get a response, Mark.
Well, I mean, so there's a few facts in there and a few non-facts. I'd say the facts: Kurt Waldheim, you know, did have a kind of a sordid World War II past, and he's appropriate to point that out. And it was probably, 100% in hindsight, the wrong choice to be UN Secretary General. But I don't think the United Nations funded, a invasion of the United States. I think, the world economic condition drove people who desire jobs from South and Central America into the United States.
Here's Terry, a Democrat in Knoxville, Tennessee. Hi, Terry.
Hey, good morning, everyone. Good morning, Admiral. I'm a former U.S. Marine, and I've actually taken part in UN operations, and I've spent my entire adult life after the Marine Corps. I'm a former EOD technician, and so I've done a lot of landmine, IED, and UXO clearance around the world. And I do take issue with what the Admiral was saying about the blue helmets. For one thing, the UN doesn't have a massive naval force or air armada. So when troops from Bangladesh or Kenya or Slovakia get in trouble in these post-enacted conflict zones, they can't call up a fleet of B-2s to fly over and bomb whoever's attacking them. We saw that in Mogadishu. The UN was not fully supported in Somalia, and the Somali clans murdered 30-something Pakistani peacekeepers. So it's very easy to say, like at the Litani River, and the Admiral, I know you know this, there is no fleet waiting off the coast in the Mediterranean or air armada circling around Lebanon to protect those Bangladeshi or Slovakian peacekeepers. Now, it might be said, oh, yeah, after they all get killed, then NATO or the U.S. will fly in and avenge them. But it's very easy to blame the UN for these issues, but you're talking about a force that couldn't conquer Sri Lanka. So it's not fair to say the UN's peacekeeping forces are not putting in a great effort.
All right. What do you think?
Thanks. First, thank you for your service. And I'll say I didn't say that what I said was they don't have the right rules of engagement, and part of that has to be they don't have the right, offensive forces, which is exactly what he was referring to. So I think they're very effective at maintaining a peaceful condition. A good example is what he mentioned, which is UXO or unexploded ordnance removal. They're great at that. What they can't do is combat operations. In other words, impose a peace. And that's for the exact reasons he said and the exact reasons I said. So I don't think we're actually disagreeing. I think he's saying it in a different way, that that the United Nations is not the kind of force that imposes peace. The only time the UN did that was in Korea in the 1950s, and really, I think we all understand that was a U.S. force with UN support, and the South Korean forces. Since then, there really has not been that kind of offensively equipped UN force to do those kind of operations.
Missouri City, Texas, Independent Line. Malik, you're on the air.
How you doing? First, I'd like to say that Donald Trump's UN speech yesterday was sheer buffoonery, full of gibberish and non-communicative talk, non-communicative speech. What I mean by that, you couldn't understand what he was really saying because he was, I guess, doing the weave, as if these people on the right call it, when you're speaking with no intelligence, no real education on the matter. The UN speech is supposed to be about spreading democracy and talking about the true freedoms around the world, yet he's talking about green energy. He doesn't even know what a fossil fuel is. People on the right don't know what a fossil fuel is. They think it just magically appears out of the ground and gets an infinite supply of oil. That is not true. The world needs an alternative to energy. Getting off being codependent on one source of energy is beautiful, not a failure as if Donald Trump will call it. He has no foreign policy. And there's no greater evidence of this than Donald Trump himself. All these conflicts he lies about that he claims he stopped. He can't even pronounce the names of the countries in which he has claimed to stop these conflicts. He can't name the leaders or the details of it. It's just something he repeats over and over again, and unintelligent people become his echo chamber. He is not intelligent at all.
Let's talk about the 7 conflicts, Mark.
Thanks. So, first, I will say it appeared that his teleprompter failed to work, and we definitely saw
in the beginning.
Yeah, so we saw
it did start working later.
Yeah, we did see a little bit of I don't know what the weave is, but we saw a little bit of filibustering there as he spoke. Look, there is a reasonable. I think each of these conflicts he had a different role in. Some he had a minor role, like India, Pakistan. I think the U.S. made a couple phone calls, but a lot of other countries were working it, and the 2 countries did not want that. These are 2 nuclear-armed countries. they were not excited about that engagement working beyond an air-to-air engagement. Other ones like Armenia, Azerbaijan, that's a serious breakthrough. And the irony is it's predicated on an economic pipeline, highway and pipeline that will benefit both countries. And I think, that's an area where he's pretty good at negotiating. So he gets bigger credit, but there wasn't active fighting going on either. So again, that's a different one. And then,
Egypt and Ethiopia.
Egypt, Ethiopia, Thailand, Cambodia. Again, we are in that case making a lot of the phone calls, and I think that's important. And in the Thailand, Cambodia one, I think we were important. And that thing was, for whatever reason, really causing a lot of civilian casualties. The random kind of artillery. And then finally, Democratic Republic of Congo, Rwanda, and the M20 in the rebel organization M23. He had a role to play. He had a pretty big role to play. So it's I agree that it's not. He didn't solve every problem himself. He solved some of them, and he participated in other ones. I think the president has a history of kind of accumulating everything into one big credit line.
Here's Don, a Republican in Elk Grove Village, Illinois. Good morning, Don.
Hi, thanks for having me. And I'd like to thank Mark for his service. And my dad was in the Navy World War II as a pharmacist mate. And anyways, I'd like to, there's a lot I could talk about, but I'm going to keep it basic. The BRICS Alliance. They're out to undermine America and their economic influence, but I think it's more than that. See, people don't realize India had war games with China and Russia a few years ago, and Modi told Biden 2 visits ago that India will never be America's friend. Okay, and this BRICS is more like the Axis and the Allies of World War II. Now, I've been watching politics since '59. I was 5 years old when Khrushchev slammed his shoe onto the table, and I've been interested in those. And it's more of and also Clinton had Ukraine give up their weapons, which set the foundation for today. And Obama let Russia take Crimea. On the open mic, he says, "If I get elected again, see what I can do for you." People don't understand what's going on. And Barry Goldwater, when Lyndon Johnson was going against Goldwater, they had the nuclear bomb going off saying, well, Goldwater gets in, we have a war. Well, no. The Vietnam War was escalated by the Democrats.
Okay. What would you like to respond to there?
So thanks. Well, first, I want to separate another acronym, CRINC, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, from BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. So the axis of authoritarians is China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. These are 4 countries that are working actively to harm democracies around the world. All 4 of those countries are at war with Ukraine. Russia's obviously in the big fight. North Korea provided troops and 6 million rounds of ammunition. Iran provided Shahed drones. And China backstopped the Russian economy and provided the microelectronics so that the Russians could build cruise missiles and hypersonic missiles that are slamming Kiev and Odessa and Kharkiv every night. So all 4 of those countries are fighting Ukraine. That's the axis of authoritarians. BRICS is more of an economic agreement between those countries. India and China are not allies. India and China have had little glacier battles with each other every decade. They do not get along, and we do need to work hard to wedge India economically away from China and Russia as well, because that's opportunity for the United States businesses. They're the largest country in the world. They're a growing economy. So to me, the CRINC, the China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, we should be opposed to them in every way possible. With the BRICS, we need to pull these countries apart, particularly work with India. I don't have time for South Africa, but Brazil is something we could work with.
Do you think that the current administration's policies towards India is furthering that goal of bringing them into our orbit as opposed to into China's?
So I think the president thought with tariffs on India it would be a quick solve and we'd get the relationship back in a good place quickly. India actually pushed back very heavily on the tariffs, and they've had the slowest development in negotiating. India doesn't like being pushed around by the United States. They have a long-standing, from running the Group of 77 and other independent groups during the Cold War. They feel that they are, somehow, on par with the United States, which economically and militarily, diplomatically, they're not. And so I think that creates a friction in the relationship. But I think over time, Prime Minister Modi and President Trump are friends. They get along. And that's probably the most important aspect of this. I think they'll solve this, but it's going to take a little bit of time.
Here's Derek, Democrat in Columbia, Maryland. Good morning.
Yes, good morning. I'd like to say to C-SPAN that I'm sorry, but this it doesn't seem to be a good choice of guests to speak of some of these subjects. Thank you for your service, sir. But all I hear is repeating some of the talking points we hear from legacy media. So we keep talking about what Russia has done or Russia is doing right now. But how about the guests talk about the NATO expansion to Russia's borders that we promised not to do? And albeit a verbal a promise or whatever you want to call it, but we made some assurances at some point in the 90s, but we don't hear that, and I'd like to guess to comment on that, and I'll take my response off the air.
That's a point that's been made, and you're right. That's not talked about much in legacy media. But I'll also say that there isn't a treaty on that. There is an agreement on that. Russia did not. Russia under Putin since 2000 has become extremely belligerent towards the former Soviet republics and former Warsaw Pact. And I think as NATO looked out and they saw, again, NATO doesn't believe that they made an agreement to not expand out. I understand Foreign Minister Lavrov constantly says that, and that's the advantage of an autocracy. You can have the same person running your foreign policy for 26 years. And so that is not a fact. What is a fact is Russian pressure on the Baltic states, former Yugoslavia, Georgia, Azerbaijan, Armenia. And when it was appropriate, i.e. when it was contiguous to their land borders, NATO reached out to the Warsaw Pact countries and to the former Soviet republics and worked with them to enter, as democracies, to enter the NATO alliance. And I don't think NATO should be criticized for that. I think the original sin in this is Vladimir Putin and his belief in restoring a greater Russia. And that's what's caused these democracies to turn to NATO.
Here's Brian, independent in Washington State. Hello, Brian.
Good morning, Washington Journal. Mark, I'm really glad you're on the show this morning. I got three things that have been really bothering me. Number one is this Bagram airport take back that Trump's talking about. My understanding is that Putin put a reward up for our soldiers in the Middle East for a bounty on our soldiers put up by Putin. And the guys that collected the checks were the Taliban. So if you would comment on that, please. Also, the admiral, or not the admiral, but the guy that was running the ship during COVID over in the Pacific, he needed to get his healthy sailors off the ship and get them on land, and Trump fired him for making an issue of sick sailors on a ship and healthy ones and trying to do the smart thing. And the third thing is, oh my gosh, I'm going to look carried away here, but bottom line is the admiral that was fired by Trump, what's his current status? Did the Taliban collect checks from Putin for killing our soldiers in the battlefield?
Okay.
And I'm waiting. I'll take your answer off there. Thanks.
Okay.
Thanks. Look, I think the Bagram airfield is a bit of a Hail Mary. I don't think that will happen. I think Trump 2025 needs to go back to Trump 2019 and tell his negotiator Zalmay Khalilzad not to negotiate away, not to say that we would be leaving completely. That's the first I'd heard him say that his negotiating position was to stay. I actually think that was the right position. We should have held Bagram. I was our lead war planner in the Indo-Pacific. I'd like nothing better than to have a major airfield with US F-35s on the opposite side of China, from the Western Pacific.
In the middle of Afghanistan.
In the middle of Afghanistan. That would have been a wonderful pressure point. We negotiated away between President Trump and President Biden we gave that away. And I think the departure from Bagram sealed the catastrophic collapse of Afghanistan in a way. I think the military officers warned President Biden about that. They did not get through. They didn't do the right thing, which is probably resign when the president wouldn't listen to them. As a result, we got the condition we're in, a horrific, chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan and the loss of that airfield. It's not coming back. As for the carrier captain in the COVID case, I think the caller's probably right that there was an overreaction to his emails where he was responsibly trying to take care of his sailors.
Can you just give us an idea of what was going on?
It was the captain of the aircraft carrier was trying to get assistance in moving members with COVID off the ship. I think it was in Guam, to a facility, to barracks, so that COVID didn't spread throughout the ship. When he didn't get good support, he emailed up the chain of command. That email leaked. I think there's probably a reasonable suspicion that he was involved in the leaking of it, and he was fired. I think that was inappropriate. I think probably his frustration, he was doing what we want ship commanding officers to do: take care of their personnel, take care of the men and women under their command. And the third thing, I think he's talking about the firing of the Chief of Naval Operations, Admiral Lisa Franchetti, by Pete Hegseth about 6 months ago or 5 months ago. Completely inappropriate. I know her personally. She's a fantastic kick-butt Navy officer in all ways possible. Had succeeded in the Navy. She was the Chief of Naval Operations because she was the best 3 or 4-star admiral to be Chief of Naval Operations, not because she was a woman. I think Secretary Hegseth, he's written pretty extensively on his feeling about women in combat, women in the military, and I think that colored his vision on this, and he fired her without any explanation.
Let's talk to Al, Silver Spring, Maryland, Republican line. Hi, Al, you're on the air.
I have a question about India and China. Why does Mark want them to be enemies? Because for the last 5,000 years before 1962, there has been no wars between India and China. If you compare the same time in Europe, there's almost 1,000 wars going on. And these two countries have been at peace for a very long time, historically. In fact, in southern India, there is a place called Cochin, which is a sister city of China. So this is a Western made-up enmity that you're causing.
Okay.
So why can't
they be friends?
So I'm not asking them to be enemies. I was commenting on the fact that as he correctly pointed out, they've been fighting over glacial territorial lines in a very high altitude for about 62 years, since 1962. And the United States didn't cause that war. The United States tried to end it rapidly. And the United States wants to be friends with India. I will say the reason that India and China had a 5,000-year peace is there's a massive Himalayan mountain range between the two countries, which for most of time prevented the movement. What he's talking about with Cochin was the great Chinese admiral taking his fleet around in the 15th or 16th century, coming to China. So I mean, there is not the fact that they're at war is not some Western concoction. The fact they're at war is they can't get a proper territorial line between the two of them, and they're both very aggressive states when it comes to their borders.
Kennesaw, Georgia, line for Democrats. Caroline, good morning.
Good morning, and thank you, Admiral Montgomery. I hope I said that right. I have a pretty simple question. Yesterday at the UN, I was embarrassed. Our leadership looked strange, and I wonder what other leaders are saying about us behind our back. I wonder if they are making plans behind our back because they don't think that we are stable. And I also wonder what this does to the morale of our troops when we look embarrassing on a national, UN yesterday. It was just, come on.
Okay.
And I'll thank you.
Yeah. First, I'll take the last part first, and I'll say this carefully. In my 36 years in the Navy, I'm not sure I ever watched an UNGA speech, and I would say until I was a pretty serious.
Montgomery points to budget shortfalls and understaffing, deficits that could put national security at risk. To close, he outlines what must change. Listen closely.
We're okay there. Now, on the more serious issue of what did the other countries think, I think the president was aggressive. I think he was aggressive in his attacks on UN performance, not just the blue helmets like we spoke earlier, but some of the, and there have been failures. The WHO did not handle COVID well. There have been food distribution problems at a number of sites. UNRWA, the UN refugee organization in Palestine, has had significant issues. All of those things are true. I don't think you necessarily need to wrap them all up in a speech and yell it out at them. So I think that part was probably a little over the top. But I also think it's probably important for them to understand that he's unhappy. Now, the good part was the Russia part. And I think it's him acknowledging. I think he even has said, not in the speech, but in comments afterwards, that he had made a mistake with Putin, that he was wrong about Putin. Those are not words you hear from President Trump that often. I think that's an important thing. And it's important for international countries to see the United States recognize that when we get played as badly as we were by the Russians.
Here's Elizabeth, a Republican in Lebanon, Ohio. Hello, Elizabeth.
Hi. My question is, did the Biden administration help or hinder current U.S.-world relations? Please be specific.
So it's a mixed bag, right? I mean, I worry our ability to deter people, our adversaries from doing bad things was hurt a lot by the chaotic withdrawal from Afghanistan. There's no doubt about that. I think Ukraine is more of a mixed bag, again, where our stepping in to provide financial support was key, but constantly limiting the effectiveness of the weapon systems, the speed with which we delivered them. It was almost like playing for a tie. I think the Europeans looked at us and didn't quite understand. So I think those were, kind of in the mixed bag. I think other areas, the Biden administration worked hard to build our alliances and partnerships back up, and they deserve credit for that. I think what's called the AUKUS deal with Australia and the UK was important for countering China and Asia.
That's a submarine deal.
That's a submarine deal plus emerging technologies. So there's AUKUS Part 1, that's the big part. You're right, the submarine deal. Then there's AUKUS Part 2, which is the future, which is emerging technologies, quantum.
To close, he outlines what must change. Listen closely.
Anti-submarine warfare. And in fact, in that area, we're hoping to bring in other countries like Japan and potentially Korea. That AUKUS deal was important. And so you have to give them credit for things. And like any administration, there's ups and downs.
And President Trump has said he will continue and abide by that AUKUS deal.
Again, this is one of those weird issues. He has. With Keir Starmer, he said that pretty clearly in Canada. And then his Undersecretary of Defense, like a mid-level appointee in the Department of Defense, announces, I'm going to do an AUKUS review. I checked with the president. I think he made a pretty clear ruling, but this is what our allies have to deal with right now. Like, are you going to listen to what the president said? Admittedly, not with a piece of paper, just verbally, but in front of the press. Or are you going to participate in a review about the long-term sustainability of a program with some mid-level bureaucrat?
All right, one more call. Ruben, Raleigh, North Carolina, independent. Good morning, Ruben.
Hey, I got a question for you about the situation down in Venezuela and Afghanistan. The United States, 5 years ago, the United States withdrew from Afghanistan. They left a lot of soldiers. They brought a lot of soldiers up out of there, and then a year later, they were ran out of there. And this president set that up. And now in Venezuela, fast forward 5 years later, they're down in Venezuela accusing these people of selling and trafficking in drugs when the drugs come from Colombia. And what's your objective in both of those theaters? Because you don't have one. Yeah. You don't even.
So I'm going to take that as what's President Trump's objective, not mine. But so I'll say for Afghanistan, I mentioned this earlier. Look, President Trump started the negotiations, but the final decision and the chaotic withdrawal 100% sits with President Biden. President Trump may well have gotten the same briefings about Bagram and Kandahar and said, I'm not withdrawing. He had already done that 2 or 3 times. He had backed out of aggressive withdrawal maneuvers in Afghanistan. So in fairness to President Trump, I do not put the withdrawal from Afghanistan on him. That belongs to President Biden. Venezuela, I think that's a true point, that the biggest drug problems in South America and Central America are not coming from Venezuela. On the other hand, the biggest threats to democracy in South and Central America is Venezuela. I think the president's team slightly conflating those two issues to get support for operations that kind of punish Venezuela a little bit. I think they probably are taking out drug boats in these attacks. I certainly hope they are.
Are you comfortable with drug enforcement moving from a policing operation to a military operation?
Yeah, I don't think it should. And I'd say that as someone, I commanded a destroyer that did 2 drug enforcement deployments where I participated. I'd bring a Coast Guard detachment on board. We would get intelligence, find a bad guy boat that, clearly had a false water line, other things. We'd meet some, law enforcement requirements, raise up a Coast Guard flag on the Navy ship. Coast Guard would go board. We'd find the drugs, arrest the drug participants, and bring the drugs on board for further destruction. That's how you handle this issue, not a precision strike munition against a boat. And the reason is, you don't know everyone who's on that boat, and you have to be careful with that. Sometimes people bring their, families along on these things. I mean, not usually, but, I don't know how you're sure of that, how they're not using human shields. We have a long tradition, decades-long tradition, of using Navy ships with Coast Guard law enforcement detachments and Coast Guard ships just doing it on their own, of doing this policing. There's nothing wrong with bringing extra forces in like the president did. Absolutely. He's president. That's his decision. But I think the term, using a kinetic weapon to resolve this, vice law enforcement, is inappropriate.
That's retired Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery, Senior Fellow at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies there at fdd.org. Thanks, as always, for coming in.
Thank you for having me, Mimi.
In about 30 minutes here on the Washington Journal, we'll have former FCC Chair Tom Wheeler discussing the Jimmy Kimmel controversy, the role the FCC plays, and what stations can broadcast. But first, after the break, it's Open Forum.